December 9th, 1941. Deep night. The island of Oahu. Lieutenant Kenji Tanaka had not slept for more than 50 hours, and the line between reality and delirium had thinned to the transparency of a spider's web. He sat with his back pressed against the trunk of a giant banyan tree, its aerial roots hanging down like the tentacles of a prehistoric monster. The damp, heavy air, saturated with the smells of rotting leaves, musty earth, and something sickeningly sweet pressed down on his lungs, making it hard to breathe. Every breath was an effort. Every heartbeat echoed in his temples with a dull, anxious thrum. His left hand unconsciously gripped the handle of his Nambu pistol, its cold metal the only thing still connecting him to his former reality. Beside him, at his feet, lay Junior Officer Yukio Ishihara. He was delirious. His lips moved, uttering disjointed words. Names, fragments of orders, lines from letters home. His body was racked with a fine tremor, despite the suffocating heat. The wound in his shoulder sustained 2 days ago had become inflamed, and a fever seemed to be burning him from within. Tanaka looked at him and felt nothing but an icy, scorched indifference. Pity, compassion, camaraderie. All of it had burned away in the flames of their downed fighter. All that remained was the animal instinct for survival and a cold calculation, sharp as a blade's edge. They were the elite of the Imperial Navy, carrier pilots, sons of the sky. 2 days ago they had brought death and destruction to this land with the arrogance of gods gazing upon an anthill. And now, they themselves had become insects, hunted prey, hiding in this green, damp hell from the very people they had considered insignificant. In the distance, the barking of dogs and muffled shouts could be heard. These were the sounds of the hunt for them. Tanaka closed his eyes. It wasn't the barking of dogs he heard in his ears, but the roar of aircraft engines, the thunder of explosions, and the death scream of tearing metal. How had they come to this? How had the sons of great Japan, warriors born for victory or a glorious death, turned into trembling fugitives hiding in the mud of a foreign land? The question was meaningless. But to understand how 2 proud samurai had transformed into primitive hunters living in constant fear, one must go back 48 hours, to that blinding dawn of December 7th, when their world, their faith, and their future seemed as unshakable as Mount Fuji. To the day when they were still conquerors. December 7th, 1941. 0-130 hours. The deck of the aircraft carrier Soryu. The cold, salt-laced wind of the Pacific Ocean lashed their faces, but no one paid it any mind. The air vibrated with the low-frequency hum of the ship's engines and was thick with the smells of fuel oil, hot metal, and something else. An intangible but pervasive scent of tense anticipation. Hundreds of men in immaculately clean uniforms moved across the flight deck with a honed, almost ritualistic precision. This was not the chaos of battle preparation, but a sacred ceremony. A ballet of death choreographed down to the last movement. Lieutenant Kenji Tanaka stood by the wing of his Mitsubishi A6M fighter, which the Americans would soon call the Zero. He ran a gloved hand over the smooth, cold skin of the aircraft, feeling every rivet beneath his fingers. This was not just a machine. It was an extension of his body, his will, his spirit. He knew every sound of its engine, every ounce of force on the control stick. Together, they were a single entity, a perfect instrument of retribution. Beside him stood his radio operator and gunner, Junior Officer Yukio Ishihara. 19 years old, little more than a boy, with eyes burning with ecstasy and fanaticism. For him, this was the first combat mission. He looked at Tanaka, his commander, as if at a deity. To him, Tanaka was the embodiment of everything he dreamed of being. Calm, confident, a veteran of the fighting in China, an ace with several kills to his name. At that moment, Tanaka had no doubt of their success. Doubt was a luxury an Imperial warrior could not afford. For weeks, they had studied maps and models, memorizing the silhouettes of enemy ships. They were trained by the best instructors, Their planes were the pinnacle of engineering thought, and their spirit, the spirit of Yamato, was indestructible. They were not going to fight. They were going to deliver justice to restore the trampled honor of the empire. The Americans, to them, were soft-bellied merchants who knew nothing of real war, of self-sacrifice in the name of the emperor. They would strike them like a hammer on an anvil and break their will to resist. He recalled the last letter he had written to his wife. A farewell letter. Every one of them had written one. It was a ritual. They were already dead men, having given their lives to the emperor the moment they stepped aboard the carrier. A great victory or a glorious death awaited them. There was no third option. "Ready, Ishihara?" Tanaka's voice was even, almost detached. "Yes, sir, Lieutenant." "For the emperor." Yukio's voice was metallic. Tanaka nodded. He had seen that fire in the eyes of hundreds of boys just like him. That fire was their main weapon, more fearsome than any cannon or torpedo. They climbed into the cockpit. Familiar movements. Buckle the harnesses. Check the instruments. Close the canopy. The world outside the glass became muffled, distant. All that remained was the roar of the engine, the vibration of the fuselage, and the beating of his own heart. One by one, the planes of the first wave tore from the deck with a deafening roar and dissolved into the pre-dawn gloom. Then it was their turn. The jolt of the catapult. A brief moment of weightlessness. And then they were in their element in the sky. Below them stretched the endless dark ocean. Ahead, in the rays of the rising sun, glory awaited them. In that dawn hour, Lieutenant Tanaka did not suspect that the sound he would hear in a few hours would not be the victorious cry of his people, but the death wail of his own fighter, crashing into the green hell of an enemy island. They were in the second wave. When their squadron approached Oahu, the sky was already streaked with black plumes of smoke rising from Pearl Harbor. The first wave had done its job. Below, through binoculars, Tanaka saw an apocalyptic scene. Burning battleships listing to one side, pillars of flame and water erupting towards the heavens. It was a magnificent and terrifying sight. He felt no elation, only a cold professional satisfaction. The chaos below was absolute. The Americans had been caught completely by surprise. Their task was to finish off what was still afloat and to suppress the airfields. Tanaka put his Zero into a dive. The ground rushed up to meet them with terrifying speed. The world narrowed to the gun sight. He saw men running across the airfield, saw the glint of anti-aircraft guns that were beginning to bark back, but too late and too disorganized. He squeezed the trigger. The 20mm cannons and machine guns spat out deadly bursts. Tracers scarred the earth, kicking up fountains of dust and fire. Something below exploded. "A hit!" came Ishihara's excited shout over the intercom. Tanaka silently pulled the plane out of the dive. Adrenaline washed over him in an icy wave. This was what he lived for. The pure, distilled meaning of a warrior's existence. They made another pass, then another. The sky around them was now boiling with the bursts of anti-aircraft shells. Black puffs of shrapnel blossomed dangerously close. The Americans were recovering. Their fury was the fury of a roused and humiliated giant. It was at that moment that it all happened. He didn't see where the shell came from. Just a sudden, deafening impact that shook the entire plane as if it were a living creature. The instrument panel lit up with a scatter of red lights. The canopy spiderwebbed with cracks. The acrid smell of burning oil hit his nostrils. "We're hit! Lieutenant, we're hit!" Ishihara's voice was breaking into a scream. Tanaka fought to level the machine. The control stick felt sluggish, unresponsive. The engine coughed, sputtered, losing power. Tongues of flame licked out from under the cowling. They were falling. Slowly. Inexorably. Tanaka glanced down. Below them was not the saving water of the ocean, but an endless green sea of jungle covering the mountains far from the harbor. He fought the machine to the last. He tried to make it to the coast, where there was a chance they could be picked up by their own submarines. But the Zero was dying. Its steel heart had stopped. In the ensuing silence, all that could be heard was the whistle of the wind through the holes in the fuselage and Ishihara's hysterical sobs. "Quiet!" Tanaka barked. Panic was as contagious as the plague. He had to maintain control. He scanned with his eyes for any patch of land suitable for a landing. But below there was only impenetrable thicket and steep slopes. Trees, hundreds, thousands of trees, tall as masts. He realized what he had to do. It was their only chance. He aimed the dying plane at the densest section of the forest, hoping the branches would soften the impact. "Hold on!" he yelled, and then there was a shriek. A deafening, soul-rendering shriek of metal tearing against tree trunks. The wings folded like cardboard, ripping away from the fuselage. The world became a green and brown carousel of branches, leaves, and earth. Impact. Darkness. He awoke to pain. Sharp, piercing pain in his chest and head. He was hanging by his straps in the shattered cockpit, buried in wreckage. An unnatural silence surrounded him, broken only by the drip of some liquid. He moved. The pain exploded into 1,000 needles. He unbuckled the straps and fell out of the cockpit onto the damp, leaf-strewn ground. His Zero was torn to pieces. What was left of the fuselage was wedged in the branches. "Ishihara," he croaked. In response, a faint moan. He crawled to the rear of the cockpit. Ishihara was alive. He was conscious, but his face was a mask of pain. A shard of metal protruded from his shoulder. Tanaka helped him out. They stood amidst the wreckage of their world, two survivors in the heart of enemy territory. Around them, a foreign, hostile forest closed in. At that moment, Lieutenant Tanaka looked at his wounded, terrified gunner, then at the pistol in his own hand. And he understood. The war was not over for them. It had just moved to a new level. Here, on this land. And if they were to survive, he would have to become not just their commander, but a tyrant, a leader, and perhaps even a god. The first few hours after the crash passed in a fog of shock and adrenaline. Tanaka, fighting through the pain of his bruises, methodically and coolly assessed the situation. He was not just a pilot. He was an officer, trained to think and act in extreme situations. First, he administered aid to Ishihara. The shrapnel was deep. Tanaka, gritting his teeth, extracted it. Ishihara screamed, then passed out. Tanaka bandaged the wound with a strip of his own shirt. Then he began to take inventory. What did they have left? 2 Nambu pistols with partial magazines, a flare gun with 3 flares, 2 officers' daggers, an emergency kit, a canteen of water, a few bars of concentrated chocolate, and a small first aid kit, its contents almost entirely used on the bandage. Not much of an arsenal for conquering an island. When Ishihara came to, his eyes were full of despair. "What do we do, Lieutenant?" "We're going to die here," he whispered, his voice tinged with hysteria. Tanaka's reply was harsh, his words clipped. "We are warriors of the Emperor. We will not die. We will fight. Our mission is to inflict maximum damage on the enemy and attempt to reach our own forces." It was a lie. He knew perfectly well that with 2 pistols they posed no threat, but he had to restore Ishihara's fighting spirit, give him a purpose. The initial plan was simple and suicidal, born not of tactical calculation but of the Bushido code ingrained in them since childhood. They would not hide like rats. They would attack, find the Americans and die in battle, taking at least one enemy with them. They pushed through the undergrowth to the edge of the forest. From here, a view of a valley opened up. In the distance, a road snaked along, with military trucks occasionally driving by. This was their chance. They set up an ambush by the road, hiding in the bushes. Ishihara, despite his wound, gripped his pistol with a trembling hand. His face was pale, but the fanatical fire had returned to his eyes. They waited. An hour. 2. The sun rose higher, the humidity becoming unbearable. Finally, they heard the hum of an engine. A jeep was approaching. In it sat 4 American soldiers. They were armed with rifles, laughing and chatting animatedly. Tanaka had already raised his pistol, ready to give the command. But at that moment, something stopped him. The cold voice of reason broke through the haze of pride and desperation. 4 men, with rifles, against 2, one of whom was wounded, with pistols effective at no more than 50 meters. This wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. They would be killed before the Americans even noticed them. They would die an inglorious, foolish death, achieving nothing. Ishihara looked at him questioningly, ready to charge at the first word, but Tanaka slowly lowered his hand. "Back," he whispered. "Into the forest." Now, the jeep drove past, oblivious. Ishihara was bewildered. "But why, Lieutenant? That was our chance, to die with honor." "We'll have plenty of time to die, Ishihara," Tanaka replied, his voice hard as steel. "But you can only win by staying alive. We were wrong. This isn't China. This is a different enemy, and we must fight him differently." That moment was the turning point. It was then that the arrogant ace pilot, the son of a samurai, died, and another man was born. A pragmatic, ruthless survivor for whom the end justified any means. He understood. Their enemy wasn't the Americans. Their enemy was this island, this forest, this hunger, this thirst, and their own stupid pride. They returned deep into the forest. By evening, their water was gone. Thirst became torturous. They had only a few hours left before complete dehydration. It seemed to be over. But it was then that Tanaka, inspecting the plane's wreckage, noticed something he hadn't before. A small tube leading from the cooling system was severed, and from it, slowly, drop by drop, a liquid was seeping. It was condensation, pure, precious water. The discovery was modest, almost insignificant, but it changed everything. Tanaka placed the canteen under the dripping tube. The water collected agonizingly slowly, 1 drop every few seconds. But it was hope. It was their first victory over circumstance. They would not die of thirst today. Ishihara watched this thin stream of life with superstitious awe. "You are a genius, Lieutenant," he whispered. "I am merely observant," Tanaka replied dryly. "And you will be too. Otherwise, we will rot here." From that day on, their new life began. Tanaka established an iron discipline. He understood that their only weapons were not pistols, but his mind and their ability to adapt. He turned the crash site into their fortress, their sanctuary. First, water. They gathered every container they could find and placed them under the dripping condensation. Second, food. The chocolate was gone on the first day. Hunger became their constant companion. A dull, gnawing ache in the stomach that drove them mad. Tanaka forbade Ishihara from eating unknown berries and roots. He remembered old soldiers' tales of tropical poisons. They started with what was safe. They caught large insects, lizards, anything that moved and couldn't fight back. They roasted them over a fire they learned to make using a lens from the gun sight. It was disgusting. It was humiliating for the descendants of samurai. But it kept them alive. Tanaka began to study the world around him with the meticulousness of a scientist. He watched the birds, noting which fruits they pecked. He memorized types of plants, trying to classify them by appearance. He turned his mind into a survival catalog. He forced Ishihara to do the same. Watch, memorize, analyze, he would repeat. Every tree, every bush, every sound can either kill us or save us. Nothing here is unimportant. Their new plan was simple and daring. They had to move towards the northeastern coast of the island. According to his intelligence, it was the least populated part. There, they might have a chance to find a secluded cove and signal a passing submarine. It was a ghostly hope, but it was better than a meaningless death in the jungle. They moved only at night, navigating by the stars. During the day, they slept in the densest thickets. It was a hellish journey. The jungle did not forgive mistakes. Every step was a risk. Poisonous snakes, spiders, thorny vines, sharp rocks. Ishihara's wound ached. He often fell behind, moaning. Tanaka practically dragged him along by sheer force of will. He would not let him give up. He shouted at him, slapped his face, humiliated him, did anything to make anger and resentment stronger than pain and despair. One day they stumbled upon an American patrol. They froze in the undergrowth, barely breathing. The soldiers passed just a few meters away, laughing and trading jokes. Tanaka's heart pounded like a drum. He looked at the relaxed, self-assured enemies, and what grew inside him was not the pride of a warrior, but the cold, calculating hatred of a cornered animal. They had conquered thirst. They had learned to find edible roots and fruits. They had survived. But this success did not go unnoticed by their hostile environment. The smell of their smoke and warmth had attracted the attention of other inhabitants of these jungles, those who were hungry. They organized their life with a persistence and method worthy of empire builders. Their empire was a patch of land a few square meters around the wreckage of their fighter. Tanaka introduced a strict daily routine, scheduled down to the minute. Rise with the first rays of sun, which barely penetrated the dense forest canopy. Morning inspection of Ishihara's wound, water collection, checking the traps for small animals that Tanaka had learned to fashion from scraps of cable and branches. Breakfast, consisting of whatever they managed to catch or find. Then, training. Tanaka made Ishihara sit motionless for hours, blending in with the environment. He taught him to distinguish the calls of birds, to understand which ones signaled danger. He forced him to memorize the patterns of bark on the trees to navigate this monotonous green hell. In the evening, dinner and preparation for the night's journey, they created their own micro-civilization, their tiny state in the heart of chaos. Tanaka was its law, its emperor. Ishihara was his only subject. The system gave them more than just a chance at physical survival. It gave them a psychological anchor. Routine, discipline, clearly defined tasks. All this was armor against the madness that crept into the dark corners of their minds each night. When they lay in the darkness, listening to the rustles of the jungle, memories would flood in. The faces of loved ones, the sounds of their hometown, the taste of familiar food. It was the most terrible torture. Tanaka ruthlessly suppressed any attempt by Ishihara to sink into nostalgia. "The past does not exist," he would say. "There is only tonight and tomorrow. Everything else is a poison that will kill us faster than any bullet." He became both a savior and a tormentor to Ishihara. He made him do things that seemed unthinkable. One day when their food supplies had run out, Tanaka caught a snake. He coolly chopped off its head with his dagger and handed the still writhing body to Ishihara. "Eat," he ordered. Ishihara threw up. He cried with disgust and humiliation. But Tanaka was relentless. He forced him to eat a piece of the raw meat. "This is not a snake. It is strength. It is life. Get used to it," he said. Ishihara obeyed. He hated Tanaka in those moments. He despised him for this cruelty, for this abandonment, as it seemed to him, of honor and dignity. But somewhere deep down he understood that it was precisely this mercilessness that was keeping them alive. They ceased to be human in the conventional sense of the word. They were becoming part of this forest. Their skin toughened, covered in scratches and insect bites. Their sense of smell sharpened. They learned to distinguish dozens of scents. Their hearing picked up the slightest rustle. Their life fell into a harsh but predictable rhythm. They had become an effective survival machine. But not everyone was prepared to live by the laws of this new world. And rebellion was brewing not in the souls of the conquered Americans. It was brewing in the soul of the sole subject of this forest empire, Junior Officer Yukio Ishihara. The crisis festered slowly, like an abscess under the skin. Ishihara's wound was healing poorly. The constant humidity, the filth, the lack of proper nutrition were taking their toll. His shoulder ached, robbing him of sleep. Along with the physical pain, his despair grew. He increasingly fell into apathy, sitting for hours staring at a single point, silent. Tanaka saw it. He tried to cheer him up, gave him new, even more difficult tasks, but it was all in vain. Ishihara's spirit was broken. He had lost faith. Faith in rescue. Faith in the Emperor. Faith in his commander. The explosion came on the 10th day of their stay in hell. They had made a short stop during their night march. Tanaka, as usual, was studying the map he had managed to save from the plane, checking it against the stars. Ishihara sat beside him. Suddenly he said in a hollow alien voice, "I'm not going any further." Tanaka raised his head. "What did you say?" "I said I'm not going. All of this is pointless. We'll never reach the coast. No one is waiting for us. We'll die here like dogs. I'm tired. I want it all to end." There was no fear in his eyes, only a boundless, all-consuming weariness. Tanaka understood what he meant. In Ishihara's hand was his pistol. "Give me the pistol, Yukio," Tanaka said calmly. "No. It's the only thing I have left. The right to choose my own death. Not to rot alive in this forest, but to die like a warrior. I will kill myself. And then you can go on alone, unburdened by a wounded comrade." This was a rebellion not against Tanaka, but against life itself. And Tanaka knew that words would not help here. He had seen soldiers like this in China, broken, burned out from the inside. He slowly stood up. "You're not a warrior, Ishihara. You are a coward. A warrior fights to the end. You've just decided to run away because it got too hard. You are betraying everyone, your parents, your comrades, the Emperor you swore to serve." "Don't you dare speak of the Emperor!" Ishihara shouted, jumping to his feet. "We are here because we blindly believed what they told us, in our invincibility, in the divine wind. And where was it when we were shot down? Where is it now? You've stopped believing yourself. You've turned into an animal that only thinks about filling its stomach. Where is your honor, Lieutenant?" He aimed the pistol at Tanaka. His hand was shaking. This was the moment of truth. Tanaka looked down the barrel of the pistol, his face impassive. He took a step forward. "Shoot," he said quietly. Ishihara froze. "What?" "Shoot if you think you're right. Kill me. But then you'll have to live with it. Or die alone. Is that what you want?" He took another step. He stood so close that the muzzle of the pistol was pressed against his chest. He looked directly into Ishihara's eyes, and in those eyes, he saw not hatred, but only pain and fear. Ishihara began to cry, silently, like a child. The pistol fell from his weakened hand. He dropped to his knees and sobbed, his whole body shaking. Tanaka said nothing. He just stood there beside him until the hysteria passed. He had defended his law. The rebellion was crushed. But while they were settling their own accounts, they failed to notice that their true enemy, hunger, was preparing its final, devastating blow. They hadn't eaten for nearly 2 days, and they knew that if they didn't find food in the next few hours, they simply wouldn't have the strength to go on. On the 12th day of their odyssey, when their strength was nearly gone, they reached the edge of the forest. Ahead, in a small valley, lay a clearing. And in the middle of this valley stood a solitary hut, surrounded by a well-tended garden. It was a farm, a small island of civilization in a green ocean of wilderness. Their first reaction was relief. Food, water, possibly clothes and medicine. But then came fear. If there was a farm, there were people, Americans, enemies. They lay in the undergrowth for several hours, watching. Soon, a man emerged from the hut. He was not an American soldier. He was an elderly, sturdy man with dark skin, dressed in simple work clothes, a Hawaiian, a native of the island. He was not white, But he was not Japanese either. He was something third, an unknown variable in their survival equation. Tanaka and Ishihara watched him, a tense struggle raging in their minds. What should they do? Go around this place? But they didn't have the strength for a detour. Besides, the sight of bananas growing in the garden and the smoke rising from the chimney was driving them mad with hunger. Attack? Kill him and take everything they needed? It was the fastest, most effective option. Tanaka looked at Ishihara. In the junior officer's eyes, he read readiness. He was no longer the boy who cried from despair. The jungle had made him cruel. He was ready to kill without hesitation. But Tanaka was once again stopped by cold reason. What if the farmer wasn't alone? What if he had a weapon? What if he managed to raise an alarm? Their short-lived victory would turn into a swift and certain death. There remained a third option, the most insane and risky one, to ask for help. But how? Who were they to this man? Enemies who had bombed his island 2 days ago. Why should he help them? He would more likely turn them over to the authorities. A decision had to be made immediately. Hunger and weakness were clouding their judgment. Tanaka decided to take the risk, but the risk had to be calculated. They waited until the farmer had gone to the far end of his plot. Tanaka left Ishihara in ambush with a pistol, ordering him to shoot in case of danger. He himself, unarmed with his hands raised, walked out into the open. The farmer didn't notice him at first. When he turned, his face froze in astonishment, which quickly turned to wariness. He reached for the machete hanging at his belt. Tanaka stopped. He knew no English, aside from a few common phrases. He did what could be understood without words. He pointed to his mouth, feigning hunger, and then he bowed, low, almost to the ground. This was not the bow of a conqueror. It was the bow of a supplicant. The farmer was silent. He looked at the tattered, emaciated man in the remains of a Japanese flight suit. There was no hatred in his eyes. There was something else. Curiosity, pity, and perhaps even compassion. He said something in his own language. Tanaka didn't understand. He bowed again, and then the farmer made a gesture with his hand, inviting him to follow. Tanaka went. Every step was a test of will. He didn't know if this man was leading him to the house to feed him or into a trap. He walked, his back tense in anticipation of a blow. They entered the hut. The farmer pointed to a bench, and he himself went to the hearth. He took out a bowl of some kind of cooked porridge and placed it before Tanaka. Then he set down a mug of water. Tanaka stared at the food, unable to believe his eyes. With trembling hands, he picked up the spoon. The first spoonful was an explosion of taste that made his head spin. He ate. He ate like an animal, choking and swallowing without chewing. And at that moment, Ishihara appeared in the doorway. He couldn't bear the weight. He burst into the house with his pistol at the ready. Seeing Tanaka eating and the farmer standing calmly by the wall, he froze in confusion. And it was precisely at that moment, in the ensuing silence, that they heard a familiar sound from outside. The hum of an approaching jeep's engine. The euphoria of salvation lasted no more than a few seconds. The sound of the approaching vehicle struck like a whip. The farmer flinched. Fear appeared in his eyes. He rushed to the back door, saying something and gesturing for them to run. Too late. The jeep stopped right in front of the house. American soldiers jumped out. It was a routine patrol, perhaps stopping by to get some fresh fruit from an old acquaintance. But when they saw 2 Japanese pilots in the house, their faces instantly hardened. "Hands up!" came a guttural shout. Ishihara instinctively raised his pistol. Tanaka managed to grab his arm. "Don't you dare," he hissed in Japanese. "It's over." Any resistance would have been pure suicide. They were surrounded. The soldiers looked at them with a somber mixture of hatred and astonishment. They were the first living enemies these American boys had ever seen. Not on maps, not in intelligence reports, but here, just a few steps away. They were roughly searched, their weapons confiscated. The farmer was also seized, shouted at, and accused of treason. Tanaka tried to explain with gestures that the old man was innocent, that he had, on the contrary, wanted to help them. But no one listened. They were bound and thrown into the back of the jeep. As the vehicle started moving, Tanaka took one last look at the farm. He saw one of the soldiers strike the old man with his rifle butt. That moment was seared into his memory forever. The man who had saved them was suffering because of them. The irony of fate was cruel and merciless. They were taken to a military base. It was another world, a world of order, discipline, and limitless resources. They saw hundreds of soldiers, scores of vehicles, a hospital with clean sheets and real doctors, and they, tattered, filthy, and emaciated, seemed like ghosts from another reality. Ishihara's wound was treated. They were fed. But this was not an act of mercy. It was preparation for interrogation. They were placed in separate cells. The interrogations were conducted by an intelligence officer, a Japanese American who spoke their native language perfectly. He was polite, correct, but beneath his calm demeanor, one could feel a will of steel. He wanted to know everything: the names of the aircraft carriers, the number of planes, the commanders' names, the plans for further operations. Tanaka remained silent. He gave only his name, rank, and serial number. This is what they had been taught. Ishihara, weakened and morally crushed, proved to be more compliant. He told them his story, the story of the crash, of survival in the jungle, of the encounter with the farmer. The Americans listened with disbelief. Their story seemed fantastic, improbable. 2 elite pilots surviving for almost 2 weeks in the wild jungle. It sounded like the plot of an adventure novel. They didn't believe it. They thought it was a specially fabricated cover story to hide their true mission. Perhaps they were saboteurs, dropped off by a submarine. Their brief occupation of the island of Oahu, their epic struggle for survival, their personal hell and their personal victory, all of it turned out to be unimportant, inconvenient, not fitting into the simple black and white schema of war. They were neither heroes nor villains. They were simply a problem that needed to be dealt with. A crime scene investigation conducted at the crash site confirmed their story. But instead of recognition, what awaited them was an order for transfer to a prisoner of war camp on the mainland. Their brotherhood, forged in the green hell of the jungle, was destroyed. Their fate was buried in folders stamped top secret. Fate scattered them like autumn leaves. Kenji Tanaka and Yukio Ishihara became some of the first Japanese prisoners of war on American soil. They were transferred to a camp in Wisconsin. For them, a new hell began. A hell of monotony, boredom, and humiliating idleness. For men accustomed to the sky, to risk, to being ready to die at any moment, life behind barbed wire was more tormenting than any physical hardship. Tanaka endured his captivity stoically. He withdrew into himself. He could sit for hours, staring at a single point, and no one knew what he was thinking. He refused any cooperation with the camp administration. To the other Japanese prisoners who began to arrive later, he was a living legend and a simultaneous reproach. A legend because he was one of the first. A reproach because he had survived instead of dying with honor. Ishihara broke completely. His physical and mental health was shattered. He was often sick, plagued by nightmares. He could not forgive himself for his capture, nor for the fact that he had survived. He considered himself a traitor. In 1943, during a pneumonia epidemic, his weakened body could not hold out. He died quietly, unnoticed, in the camp infirmary. He was only 21 years old. Official documents were silent about the fate of the Hawaiian farmer, whose name was Kaleo. A military tribunal most likely did not bother to delve into the subtleties of his motives. In wartime, everything is simple. If you help the enemy, you are the enemy. His subsequent fate remains unknown. After the war ended, in 1946, Kenji Tanaka was repatriated to Japan. He returned to a country he did not recognize. His hometown had been wiped off the face of the earth by an atomic bomb. His wife was dead. His home was destroyed. The entire world for which he had fought had turned to ash. He was a hero of a forgotten war, a symbol of trampled pride. He, like many other veterans, found it difficult to find his place in the new life. He took a job on a fishing trawler. He lived a long but quiet and lonely life. He never told anyone what had happened to him on Oahu. It was his secret, his curse, and his greatest treasure. He was buried in an old cemetery in a small coastal town. But, as the locals said, on his grave, among the ordinary flowers, strange exotic plants that do not grow in those parts would sometimes appear. Who brought them? No one knew. The official history of the war in the Pacific is a story of great battles, armies of thousands, and brilliant strategies. In this grand chronicle, there is no place for the story of two pilots who crashed on an enemy island. Their 2-week war for survival became just a line in a secret report, gathering dust in an archive. Their feat, their suffering, their transformation from proud conquerors to hunted animals, all of it was erased, forgotten, deemed insignificant. The system does not like inconvenient stories that disrupt the harmony of a black and white worldview. But stories have a remarkable quality. Even when buried alive, they find a way to sprout to the surface. The story of Lieutenant Tanaka and Junior Officer Ishihara did not vanish without a trace. It became a legend. Among the old residents of the north shore of Oahu, rumors circulated for a long time. It was said that in the first days of the war, 2 strange ghost-like men in tattered foreign uniforms were seen in the jungle. It was said that they could appear and disappear without a trace, that they fed on roots and hunted snakes. Children would scare each other with stories of the 2 forest spirits, Japanese soldiers who never left the war and still roam the mountains to this day. This story turned into local folklore, a bedtime horror story, losing its connection to its real heroes. But it lived on. It proved to be more durable than military archives and non-disclosure orders. Was their struggle worth such sacrifices? From the perspective of the Great War, no. They did not change its course one iota. But from the perspective of the human spirit, undoubtedly. They lost the war, but they won their main battle. The battle with themselves, with despair, and with primordial chaos. This story is not just a chronicle of a forgotten episode of World War II. It is a reminder that behind every line in a history textbook, behind every flag on a staff map, there are living people. And their personal tragedies, their feats, and their pain often turn out to be much greater and more important than the resounding victories and crushing defeats. They came to this land as conquerors, but became its prisoners. They wanted to enter history as heroes, but they became a legend whispered in hushed tones. And perhaps therein lies the ultimate justice